Welcome everyone to webinar 4 of 4 for Revolutionary Ideals. I am very excited to welcome our speaker for tonight, Dr. Mary Bilder, and thanks to National History Day and the Dr. Scholl Foundation for sponsoring this wonderful experience. Okay. So this is the usual slide. Remember to use the Q&A box. We don't have an active chat here, but know that we will be asking you, or Dr. Bildo will be asking a couple of questions tonight. So make sure you have that Q&A box handy. Lynn and I will be taking a look at the responses there and sharing them out to the whole group. Surveys required, so make sure that you complete that within the week. In the morning, as usual, you'll have access to the slides, recording, and resources available under webinar form materials on Google Classroom. Two very important things that I'll talk about a little bit later today in my pedagogy piece. The final survey is different from the attendance survey for webinars. That will be available to you the moment that our session ends tonight and is due Wednesday, April 17th. It's not on content, it's mostly big picture. What is your take on the entire course of this webinar series? And more information I will share about the final assessment. And it's very important that you mark down in your calendars that it is due on Monday, April 15th. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let Dr. Bilder take over.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to share, we're switching out our sharing. So I'm going to share this here and I'm going to wait a second and make sure that that worked okay. Krista and Lynn, did that work?
Yeah, we can see it clearly.
So we're going to start. Here, and I love doing these kinds of presentations. I actually prefer doing them live because then I can talk explicitly to people. And so I'm really hoping that people will take advantage of the Q&A function. I spend a lot of my time teaching in a law school situation where we try to let people have an opportunity to comment. I often tell my students, talk to your neighbor about this, and I'm hoping that we can do that. So I thought I'd start with this slide. I'm going to talk about the age of the Constitution, sort of mini lecture on the period in which the Constitution comes into existence in the way that it grows and binds the United States, and some of the issues about that. But I wanted to begin with this slide because I think that for teachers, teaching about the Constitution is challenging. And you can see here that that what I've said is the question doesn't feel academic. It might not feel neutral and apolitical. So I guess I would just ask if people can take a minute to read this slide and then maybe write into the Q&A some of the challenges they experience in teaching topics related to the Constitution or teaching the history of the Constitution. And we'll give everybody a moment to type some things in.
And you thought you were just going to sit back and listen, but what fun would it be to have a history webinar without some active learning? All right, looks like we've got some answers starting to come in. So responses: the tension between how it's supposed to work and how it actually works. People tend to get very cynical and sarcastic, especially adults. The buy-in is always the hardest.
Yeah, those three are just all great classic, I think, things that come up when we talk about the Constitution. Those of us who teach in law schools have, really live in that space between the tension between how it's supposed to work and how it works. I think in the current political age, it's hard not to get cynical. And I think that cynicism sometimes represents our own worries about it, our own complexities about it. And I think I can only imagine for younger people, saying you're going to learn about the Constitution doesn't sound like the most exciting thing. And so getting people to buy in obviously is a big challenge. I think we have some more people, I think.
couple people saying they don't find it challenging, but a couple other thoughts. Some challenge having students understand complex topics and relating it to everyday life. High school students don't care because they don't think it actually applies to them. Teaching the Constitution is messy, just like the Constitution. Let's see here. Teaching. Okay, so how do you balance opinions about the Constitution with the facts about the Constitution? I'm kind of summarizing a couple, putting 2 or 3 together in this one. But how do you deal with the history and the ideas in the Constitution without getting into modern day liberal and conservative debates about it?
Yeah, I think these are all just really outstanding answers. And they, in some ways, if we just step back and think about it, this is one of the first questions I like to ask when we talk about the Constitution and thinking about the history of the Constitution, because I think it helps to begin the conversation by realizing that unlike maybe other questions, the Constitution's both a historical matter, a historical issue, and it's also an issue that affects everybody today, and it affects everybody in the future. And I think in that sense, the sort of history matters. So I'm going to tell a story about that history that in some way comes out of a lot of my research, but also comes out of this effort to think about how do we combine talking about a historical document and a historical process, which is, to me, super exciting and really interesting, with the fact that those questions about the history are always loaded. And the Supreme Court right now actually tells us that that history is a place that we look to answer modern questions. So let me begin by let me get here, saying a little bit about myself. This is me with short, much longer hair, sort of post-COVID, and I've written quite a lot now on this constitutional period. I wrote a book on the colonial period, on colonial legal culture on Rhode Island. I wrote the book that you see James Madison's face on about Madison's diaries of the Constitution, his notes as a biography about that. I've more recently written a book about the first female lecturer in the United States, Eliza Harriet O'Connor, who lectures about women in Philadelphia in 1787 at lectures attended by George Washington and other convention delegates. And then I think of the many things I've done, one of the ones I'm most proud of is the essay that I wrote, The Age of the Constitution, for this volume, With Liberty and Justice for All, the Constitution in the Classroom. And I really can't recommend this volume enough to people who teach this topic in secondary education. The editors are secondary school teachers, and they worked incredibly hard to make this both a good resource for teachers and also, particularly I think for high schools, a place where people might be able to teach an advanced class. But I think it's a really phenomenal resource for teachers. It has a lot of documents in it. It has a website that accompanies it, and it has essays by a number of constitutional historians on the various periods in constitutional history. So I'm going to try today, in what I understand is not very long, to talk about these questions. What was the age of the Constitution? What does or did Constitution mean? How does Constitution relate to representation? Who are or were the we? How is the genre of the Constitution changing? How does a written Constitution include and exclude the people? And why focus on the phrase, we the people? I'm going to begin by talking about what was the age of the Constitution. The age of the Constitution is a phrase that I use to describe the period between 1760 and around 1804. And let me explain why I choose this period. Those of you who teach any kind of American history survey or do the work in the various classes under core curriculum requirements that cover this period know that I'm sort of crossing two periods that don't always get put together, but they fit together in a constitutional sense. So this period begins in 1760 for me with the accession of George III, and you can see George III up there. The accession of George III in the sort of towards the end of the conflict that we often refer to as the French and Indian War gave an opportunity for particularly the American colonists, but also the British, to reimagine what the constitutional relationship was. It was a change in administration that sort of provided a space and an opportunity, and it also, required sort of new constitutional thinking. And in some ways, 1760 marks the beginning of the period that we think of as the revolutionary and constitutional period. And I tend to think of this period as ending in 1804. 1804 is the date of the 12th Amendment passing. And the 12th Amendment passing really creates the Constitution that governs the country until the Civil War period with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so that's 1804 with the 12th Amendment is when the Constitution's amended to alter the voting for president so that we have from like what I think of as high school voting, where the top vote getter gets to be the president and the second vote getter gets to be the vice president, to the modern version of voting where within the Electoral College, there's a separate ballot for president, a separate ballot for vice president. And that gives rise to the two-party system, and that really creates modern politics. And by 1804, the Supreme Court has moved into the beginning of its role as a court that's going to interpret the Constitution in all sorts of ways. So that's that space that I'm talking about, where the Constitution really comes into existence. And in the documents that I gave you, we have 4 documents that I think represent sort of pieces of this story exceptionally well. The Stamp Act Congress in 1765, and I'm going to use that to talk about an idea of representation and the British Constitution. The materials on Quock Walker in 1783, which again raises issues of representation now under state constitutions, under the Massachusetts Constitution and the Virginia Constitution, which has similar language. The Ladies' Editorial in 1790, which again raises the question of representation, but now thinking about it in the context of the 1787 Constitution, the first national written constitution. And then Madison's speech introducing the amendments, the revisions that will become eventually what we come to know as the Bill of Rights in 1789. And we can see there the idea about representation. And now what do we think of when we understand a written constitution? So that's the period we're talking about. So what does or did Constitution mean? And this is a slide to remind us that Constitution means a lot of things. This is probably the thing that it means most to most people. It's very recognizable in the American context by the first words, we the people. That word that shows up here on the baseball and on all sorts of tchotchkes. But Constitution means a lot more than that. And so I thought we'd just stop for a second and let people answer into the question and answer some things that we use today to explain what is the Constitution. So what are things, if you asked your students, or what would come to mind when they think about what is a constitution? What does the Constitution mean?
Now, we know this group is not shy because they email us. All right. Now we've got a whole bunch coming in. Our rights, the role of the government, written law of the land. It's a living, breathing document. A living document that can change with the times. A set of rules and laws to explain how government works. A set of guidelines or a roadmap. Let's see, guiding document. plan of government or framework for government. And we've got two more ideas: social contracts and rights and responsibilities of the government and its people. So lots of good ideas in there.
Yeah, so that's great. And if you think about the things that people have contributed, it's such a beautiful example of the sort of two ways that we think about the Constitution at the same time. On the one hand, a number of people mentioned a written document or a blueprint or something written down in writing. And that's very much a part of what we come to believe about the Constitution. And on the other hand, lots of people also mentioned a framework or something softer, a kind of organizational structure. And that's also something that we understand about the Constitution. Many of the things that we define as the Constitution, the fact that we can describe a document that we can look at and point to, actually develop after 1787. And that's the story I want to tell. Out of an earlier understanding of Constitution, that is this sort of framework, underlying style of government. And it's that transition that's very interesting, and the fact that that transition is never complete. So let me begin here in the 1770s and 1780s. And what we see on this slide here are some documents relating to that period, in the period where state constitutions are coming into existence. And you can see on the left of the slide, we have a example of the way that the Massachusetts Constitution was first printed and the North Carolina Constitution was first printed. And we can see there that Constitution is used as the Constitution or frame of government, the Constitution or form of government. We can even see that when we look on the right side, which is one of the first volumes to contain both the Constitution of the separate states, the Declaration of Independence, and the Articles of Confederation and treaties. And here again, we see Constitution used in this framework way, form of government. In the period before 1776, the word Constitution appears all over the place in the sort of Anglo-American universe. But before 1776, it refers to a frame or system of government. And what they thought Constitution meant were the unwritten practices and key written documents in England, like the Magna Carta, the 1689 Bill of Rights, and also from the colonial Americans' point of view, key colonial documents like the colonial charters. So what they thought about Constitution when they used that word was the system of government that constituted their world, not a particular document you could point to and interpret. There were written documents that were part of that, but that they were not in and of themselves the Constitution. The Constitution was this softer system of government, this frame that limited government, but it did so in a kind of complicated way. In the period between 1776 and 1804, the period that begins with the Declaration of Independence and basically ends with the 12th Amendment, we get a new idea about a constitution. The Constitution becomes the sort of way we think of when we capitalize it. It's actually something we can point to. And this is because we develop a new genre, basically, of governmental form, the idea of a written constitution. But the written constitution isn't invented in one fell swoop in 1787. It develops over this period, and it never completely erases this older understanding of constitution as a frame or system of government. So in 1804, one can look sort of snapshot at American government, and you can see really the very beginning of our notion of a written constitution, where we have a constitution we can point to. It's been amended with 12 separate written amendments. We have a two-party system, and we've moved to accepting, to some degree, that the Supreme Court's going to act as an interpreter. The Constitution today continues to have both of these meanings. Whoops, sorry there. Ooh, sorry. In England, right, people may know that the British Constitution remains basically unwritten, and that's an interesting thing for students to know about. Massachusetts has what we call the oldest functioning written constitution, but it was originally described as a form of government. And Constitution really has become part of our general culture, both politically, as you can see in the bottom, but also in the way that we continue to use that word to describe all sorts of other kinds of organizational pledges or founding agreements. So let me turn to these key documents that I shared with you to see if I can pull out a few other aspects of how the word Constitution relates to we the people, who's included or represented in our form of government. And I want to begin with the Stamp Act, where we see representation under the British Constitution. So if we can stop for a second and think about what does the Stamp Act, particularly the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, suggest about representation, suggest about how people are thinking about a constitution. So for people for whom this period's a little foggy, they don't teach it all the time, I put together this little slide here that tells us kind of where we are historically. This is the period in the 1760s where the British government decides to raise taxes, raise money on the American colonies. And they begin to also impose a standing army. They leave a standing army, actually, from the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act looks like a duty, so it doesn't produce the same kinds of protests. But in 1765, Parliament passes a Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act basically feels to American colonists like a tax. It's that Stamp Act that produces all sorts of outcry. Patrick Henry's speech, this very famous Join or Die cartoon. Because for American colonists, the Stamp Act feels like taxation outside of the constitutional practices that they had been used to. And we see this is why Pennsylvania, this is the Pennsylvania newspaper, imposes a little skull and crossbones where the stamp was supposed to be. Under pressure from Americans and within the British Parliament, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but in its place, they pass the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act declares that the Parliament has the power and authority to bind the colonies and people of America. And that really produces, in the wake of the Declaratory Act, the Intolerable Acts. It's all of the run-up to the American Revolution. So we can see in this document that at the core of this document is a question about representation and constitution. And so I put this slide together, and let's just see, everyone's so great at typing in fast. What words do we see that speak to us about the American idea of representation and constitution in this moment?
All right, let's see. We've got local circumstances. What else? What pops to you, or what pops to your students? A couple more. Chosen by themselves. People. Represented. Chosen. Imposed. A couple repetitions of those in there.
Yeah, so great points. And you might notice that what this does, although other parts of the Stamp Act Congress use other vocabulary, is we don't see the word subject, right? We don't see a word that is, I mean, don't get me wrong, you can be like, section 3 does, section 7 does, okay. But in these two key paragraphs, what we see is the kind of vocabulary and understanding that's in some ways, right, prefiguring where we know we're going. It's who is the body that should be represented? The people. Why should they be represented? Because people deserve to have government that is adapted to their local circumstances. Parliament across the ocean can't do that. Therefore, representation is based on people chosen by ourselves. The people the whole people, get to choose people themselves, and that allows for constitutional government. Here in the key fact, right, taxes imposed, and we can see constitutionally imposed. So this is actually a constitutional theory in which, what does it mean to have a legitimate constitution? It means a legitimate constitution or form of government is one in which representatives of the people are chosen by the people. And in some ways, right, this is a radical idea. This comes at a moment when virtual representation is the large understanding of how the British Parliament works. The British Parliament does not work on actual representation. It works on virtual representation. There is no notion in England that you should choose representatives who represent you. And you can see this is a wonderful classic cartoon mocking virtual representation. And this idea of thinking about representation and thinking about who the people are begins to allow us to expand our notion of who counts as the people and how we're thinking about representation beyond the traditional ways that we sometimes look to think about political power. So this is a period in which what we begin to see as we open our lens outwards is many people participating in activities that describe themselves as the people, insisting that the people should be represented, should be allowed to choose their own government. And a great example of this, right, would be Crispus Attucks in the Boston Massacre, and then the responses around basically using Crispus Attucks and the story around Crispus Attucks, a person of color, to describe who is one of the people. Who do we think of as the people? And we see in this moment in the Boston Massacre, this larger notion of the people beyond simply people inside colonial legislatures. And we can see this also when we turn to documents, that we experience people outside of the sort of traditional white male political world expressing the same kinds of constitutional sentiments. So just to give you two examples, here in 1773 is one of just a number of petitions brought by Black Americans petitioning about slavery. And the right of petition is one that we see in the Stamp Act Congress. The right of petition is a constitutional right to argue, to declare, to ask the legislature to do something. So by petitioning the legislature, that's a way of describing yourself as a person who belongs to the political community. And similarly, we can see that same type of understanding of how the language of the people, the language of the revolution, the language of what does it mean to be represented is in this most famous letter between Abigail Adams and John Adams. This is the famous letter where she asks John Adams to include in a code of laws rights relating to the people. And this is people have different interpretations about how expansive she's understanding. Does she just think she wants an end to the rights controlling married women? Does she think more expansively about this? As somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about women's rights in this period, I think it's very important that she ends this by saying, we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And that's precisely the same argument that we just saw the Stamp Act Congress had made. So here's Abigail Adams echoing that same argument about what does it mean to be represented, who's represented, and basically insisting that women deserve to have representation unless basically a voice or representation. So we can then go out farther to the next three documents in the materials and ask, who are or were the we? How is the genre of constitution changing? And how does a written constitution include or exclude the people? And let me begin here with the story of Quock Walker. I think the last lecture may have covered in quite considerable detail the story of the way in which slavery and anti-slavery operated in this period. So I'm just going to briefly touch upon it. But in Massachusetts, between basically the 1760s and 1780, there are at least three 30 freedom suits. Probably the most famous is the Elizabeth Freeman suit. It's one of the first where Elizabeth Freeman wins her freedom. And these are suits brought by Black Americans who basically argue that they should not be enslaved any longer, and they're brought against their enslavers. And this is the beginning of the changes in slavery that are going to bifurcate the United States, as increasingly in the northern colonies and middle colonies, efforts are brought about to basically begin to end slavery, whereas in the southern states, increasingly, slavery is going to become embedded in law. Thomas Jefferson's contemporaneous notes on the state of Virginia becomes very important in the way in which slavery gets embedded in the South. Now, if we turn to Massachusetts, in 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution included a free and equal clause, and you can see it there. All persons are born free and equal. And in the wake of the passage of that, in 1783, the Quock-Walker case occurs. And the Quock-Walker case involved Quock-Walker, basically a series of cases arguing that he was not enslaved. And in the cases that go up to the court, and you have those cases in the material, the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts basically says that what the free and equal clause means is that all men are born free and equal, that everyone is entitled to liberty, and that the Constitution abolishes slavery. And so Quock-Walker is often referred to as the first case in which a constitution is understood to be liberating, basically ending slavery. Now, it's important to note that it wasn't just the Constitution. Later on, another person in Massachusetts wrote to one of the letters from Virginia, and he pointed out that many enslaved people had basically taken advantage of their understanding of the Constitution and obtained freedom themselves, or just took it. And so this reminds us that constitutions free people both by their explicit right decisions within the legal system, but also in this time, constitutions freed people because people basically decided they wanted to be freed. What's important to also understand is that Virginia had the exact same language, basically, in their constitution. And the Virginia legislatures basically said it doesn't end slavery. It's just declarative. It doesn't mean when you put something in a constitution that it is liberating. Now, this allows us, when we think about Quock-Walker or people in Massachusetts reading the Massachusetts Constitution and imagining themselves to be enslaved, to be liberated, and then ending slavery themselves, that the group of people who we can think of in this moment as being empowered by constitutions is broader than just the people in the room. In the upper left-hand side here, we see the kind of way we imagine the Constitutional Convention with the key male figures. But we know in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, all sorts of other people are interacting with those delegates, are putting pressure on the ideas caused by to be written down in that document. And so just to give you a couple examples, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society is reconstituted in this period. It will actually work to abolish slavery. The Free African Society is begun by the Reverend Absalom Jones. It will work to basically help free Blacks and enslaved Blacks in Philadelphia. 4 Native Nation representatives travel to Philadelphia, meet with George Washington, prominently shake his hand, and he promises basically pledging his agreements with treaties and to take care of treating them as sovereign nations. And the Eliza Harriet O'Connor becomes the first example of a female lecturer arguing for a advanced type of female education, and arguing in this quote we see in the right in the newspapers that the toilette and the drawing room will be deserted for the forum and the college. Now, this actually can be argued that it actually affects the way that we interpret the Constitution and the Constitution gets drafted. So let me just talk about this in the context of gender. The drafting of the 1787 Constitution included a number of places which referred to gender or to sex. And the most dramatic is the one you see in the lower left-hand corner, where people who were enslaved escaping from their enslaver, that draft amendment to the 1787 drafts of the Constitution in that summer included the word she. And this tells us the sort of way in which enslaved women's agency was so important. The person who basically wrote that couldn't even imagine someone escaping without also imagining women escaping. But the Constitution becomes completely gender neutral, and it's unusual in a period in which constitutions are sort of all over the place in terms of this question. Every gendered reference becomes a gender neutral reference. And we can see this in this slide, which shows how consistent the 1787 Constitution is in terms of using person and the generic he, and he is a generic in this period. And so maybe by the fact that Eliza Harriet O'Connor was giving lectures, dramatically talking about the idea of women participating maybe in the college and the forum, the Constitution itself reflects that larger community in the fact that the Constitution of 1787 is not exclusionary with respect to gender. It describes only persons who could be of any gender in all of its offices. And this is where we see this reflected in the 1790 editorial that I have here about the ladies. The idea is the custom of the world of excluding women from legislation. It hasn't yet become a constitutional principle that women are excluded. We see the same idea here. Who should be represented? Who's obliged to follow imposed laws? People need to be represented. That's what constitutions should do. Historians know that in the period between the 1780s into the early 1800s, women and people of color vote in the state of New Jersey under a constitution that is interpreted in a gender-neutral way. And in fact, the Museum of the American Revolution has a wonderful online exhibit about this. So this is a period where basically it's still up for grabs about who participates in the we, the people. Now, this is going to change gradually as increasingly the written Constitution takes on its sort of more textual meaning. In large part, this is due to the fact that the written Constitution gets amended. And so let me end by talking about the amendment process. You have in the materials Madison's speech amending the 1787 Constitution. People may know the 1787 Constitution is passed. It goes out to be ratified. There's a large ratification struggle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. One of the consistent complaints that the Federalists have to deal with is the fact that the Constitution doesn't contain rights. Now, the Constitution does contain some rights, but it doesn't contain a list of rights in the way that a number of the state frames of government had included. The Federalists initially argue you don't need them, but gradually, even as the Constitution becomes passes through the required 9 states ratification, they come to decide that maybe amendments wouldn't be such a bad idea. One of the great correspondences around that is between James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And they argue in letters back and forth about whether amending the Constitution with rights will be a good idea or not. Madison was worried about amending it because he worried that if you actually wrote them down, they would be too small, not as broad as they needed to be. But he also came to believe that, and we see this in the middle quote, the political truths declared would become incorporated with the national sentiment. That is, one of the advantages of amending the Constitution would be not that just it would be used legally, which is what Thomas Jefferson thought, but that people would come to believe it culturally, that they would sort of have an extra legal or a larger idea. James Madison, when he gets into Congress, has run on a campaign pledge that he will amend the Constitution with revisions. And he gives a speech. Everybody else tells him, we have other things to do. We don't need to amend the Constitution. But Madison argues for amendments. Among the many amendments he suggests are amendments about the Bill of Rights. And we see in this slide his notes on the Bill of Rights there, and you can just see sort of like this is his amendments. He writes Bill of Rights right over there on the right. The interesting thing about Madison's amendments is Madison believed that the Constitution should be revised, and the amendments should be incorporated within the Constitution itself. Roger Sherman argued that the amendments should be added to the Constitution. And there was a great fight in Congress over whether amendments to the Constitution should occur by revision, that is, putting them in the places they belonged in the Constitution, crossing out the other things, or by tacking them on the end. And people had very strong differing points of view on what this meant. Today, many state constitutions are still amended by revision. But the federal Constitution, basically because of congressional vote, Roger Sherman wins, and we decide that the amendments will be tacked on to the end. And what this does is this creates for us this notion of the Constitution as coming into existence in 1787, being intact in that moment, and then the amendments sequentially being added onto them. And it's really only with this decision to amend by basically tacking the amendments on that the idea of the Constitution that we come to understand, that somehow it's very connected to the 1787 moment, comes into place. But even in that space where we begin to see the written Constitution taking on more meaning, even as we begin to amend with the Bill of Rights, notions about what that written Constitution should include, we can see that the framing people, the members of Congress, are still imagining the document as not being the only thing to look at. And so this is just all sections from Madison's original speech. The first one is Madison explaining he wants to have rights because of the general welfare and necessary and proper clauses, that the government has more than enumerated power. The second one is Madison's explanation of why we need the Ninth Amendment, because he argues that there are rights beyond the ones that are enumerated. And we don't want people to think that only the ones that are written down matter. And so we can see here that even as we begin to see the notions of the written Constitution, that it will be amended by tacking on, that the written text will stay intact, it's not written in a very narrow textual sense. They're still imagining that that frame of government, that larger idea, will continue. Madison's amendments, Congress sends 12 out to the states. We know 10 are ratified. Eventually, they become known of as the Bill of Rights. Now, one of the things that happens with this powerful new genre, the genre of a written constitution, a constitution that's down on paper and that has to be amended, is even though in some ways the Constitution in our understanding will become a constitution of inclusion, in the beginning, one of the things that a written constitution turns out to be very good at is exclusion. That is, One of the problems with a written constitution turns out to be that it becomes a powerful way to exclude people who are not in political power from having political power. And the most dramatic version of this involves representation. In 1792, Kentucky writes a constitution in which it uses the word free male citizen. In 1807, New Jersey reverses its original idea that women and people of color can vote by creating basically legislation that says only free white male citizens can vote. Every state admitted between 1802 and 1876 into the United States of America does so under a constitution. It is a constitution of representational exclusion, describing people who can participate either as free or white, always using the word male, and then describing people, inhabitants, and citizen. This is the period in which we often describe as the rise of democracy, and it is true with respect to white men. This is an expanding group of people, but it does that by similarly excluding everyone who is not a white male from participating in representation. And it's that exclusionary aspect of the written constitution, which is so very, very hard to change, that gives rise in the Civil War and then post-Civil War period to basically arguments that again bring up representation, but this time where you can only get representation by changing the Constitution. And so the right side shows Charlotte Rollins, who's a Black woman in South Carolina, who's the only woman who basically accepts the invitation of the South Carolina legislature to come and argue for women's suffrage, for basically women having the right of representation. Who are we, the people? How do we think about our relationship to the framing moment? On the left, we see one of the most famous examples of the Washington family, George, Martha, an enslaved man, William Lee, in the background. We have a sort of picture of power. And I contrast that here with a modern picture of the Obama family in 2011, right? I like this picture because we also have sort of a presidential family around a table. So it's wonderful images to have the students talk about what's changed, what's not changed. My students are always like, and they're both super fancy mansions still. Who are we, the people, and how do we relate this story to people? Well, for me, I like to talk about we the people. And I think this is a way to come back to a lot of the comments that people made and why this is hard. For me, one of the ways to tell a story, which allows us to tell the story of a transition from a frame of government to a written constitution, from a world in which representation is a key aspect of how we think about how the American colonists fought, to a story in which we first have exclusion and then gradual inclusion, is to go back to the words of the preamble. The words of the preamble tell us that the Constitution belongs to we the people. And that's a broad category of encompassing idea. And what is the purpose of that? It's to form a more perfect union. That's what this Constitution is for we the people to work to form a more perfect union. For me, returning to that aspect of the Constitution itself, reminding students that our Constitution explicitly tells us that at the beginning, in letters that were always printed bigger, so that you didn't have to pay attention to any of the small part, but you pay attention to this part that we still memorize. That's a way of telling this narrative in a way that is both accurate to the history, but also inclusive of all the people in our room and hopeful about an aspiration for the future. And I'm just going to end by saying one of the things I ask my American legal history students is how many of you had to memorize the preamble and how many of you can say it still today? And I'm amazed every year by probably 80% of the class can still recite this, not because of anything we learn in law school, but because of memorization that they did basically in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I am among the people who can still say the preamble. I am going to take over sharing the screen. Okay. So it's my intention to go through this relatively quickly. This is information that I have shared with you all before. I want to make sure that we have as much time as possible for you to ask the questions that you have for Dr. Builder. So just a couple of points that I want to share with you about completing the final assessment for this course. As is listed in the syllabus, but a reminder that this is worth 40% of your grade. So completing it is required for passing the course. Though we have been able to be flexible on due dates and to be able to accommodate your life and your schedules in various ways in the past, we are unable to do that for this final assessment because of the grading schedule that we have that's dictated by the university schedule. So the final assessment is due to you in just less than a week by next Monday, April 15th. If you haven't seen it yet on Google Classroom, you'll find both directions for the final assessment and a template that you can use to fill in the template. There are prompts for you. It essentially functions as a worksheet. So knowing that you have a tight time frame, we've given you all that we can to hopefully make this painless process. Okay, here are some screenshots from the directions themselves, and those bullet points are things that I want to point out to you. So at base, what we need you to do is connect to some idea that is germinating in your mind from Rev Ideals. It must clearly use at least one primary source and clearly use an active learning strategy. Doing this, creating lessons, creating activities, and I want to be really clear, this is an activity that could be 15 minutes, no more than 60 minutes. You're not revamping any kind of a curriculum. This is an activity that you think will be good for you, for your students, that benefits you all in your classroom. So this is in your wheelhouse. You know how to do this. This isn't an insurmountable task. We don't all invent resources and lessons from scratch. There's a lot of reinvention, reuse, remixing that all of us do. That's perfectly fine, and I certainly encourage you to do that, but be sure that you're citing sources. There's not an explicit place to cite sources on that template, so just add it to the bottom if you are citing or building from any sources. Exactly what we tell our students to do, to cite our sources. Generally, don't spend more than 90 minutes creating this activity. This isn't meant to be some massive activity that takes up a ton of your time. This is a place for you all to take the work of the course and to make something useful for you and your students, and then to share it with the rest of us eventually. So here's a couple things that you can look for if you're thinking about, where can I find source material? Maybe you have something identified already. Maybe you want to look at something new. Here I have a screenshot of our ongoing list of suggested further reading and resources. And this is for webinar 4, module 4. And you'll see that there's a list there in the bottom of online teaching resources. One thing that I was particularly captivated by are some really great articles and think pieces about using podcasts in the classroom. So in the links that you'll see here, there are experienced teachers who have used them in the middle school classroom in a sort of abbreviated way, and then teachers who have also used them in more advanced classrooms. So just an idea to plant in your minds. And then maybe some suggestions if you're looking for an active learning strategy. And I want to be clear here that these 5 tips are not active learning strategies in themselves, but they may be a launching point for you to engage your students in an active learning strategy. So a reminder to you all that there are lots of resources available to you just from this course, just that we have crowdsourced from this course. So I want to build you up a little bit and remind you that you have great resources in front of you that so many of you have already contributed to. Also, just one final note, if you have questions about this at all, I am so happy to talk to you about all things teaching and learning. Send me an email with a couple available time slots. Some of you have taken me up on that, and I have so enjoyed our conversations. So please send me an email so we can chat about this final assessment. And finally, I invite you to go into the Q&A box and share some questions for Dr. Builder. And as you're doing so, here's the QR code, and here is the link to complete your final webinar 4 survey for attendance for webinar 4.
All righty. Thanks so much. This is a great opportunity. Questions for Dr. Builder, questions about the final assessment. Keep in mind, don't overthink this. Don't make this an impossible task. Build on something interesting and we'll share. So you'll not only be able to take your idea, but you'll be able to pull lots of different ideas from your colleagues as well. But trust is something, you can't just put somebody else's lesson plan in and have it count. Can you build off, get inspired by, find sources by? Sure, just tell us where it came from. All right, it's time for questions. I have one in the queue, but please go ahead and drop them in no matter what it's about. Dr. Builder, first question is for you. Amanda is really interested in learning more about the ladies' editorial and the responses to that editorial, who would have agreed with it, who would have disagreed with it. And she wanted to know where she might be able to find some of those responses. That sounds like a lesson ready to happen.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I love that. I love that editorial. I teach that editorial, and I teach also along with that editorial the newspaper advertisements that one of the newspaper advertisements that Eliza Harriet posted from the summer of 1787 when she gave her lectures, and that's all in my book Female Genius, which you can get. You can actually write UVA and tell them you want a discount. They keep telling me they'll give everybody a discount who writes. So I actually, just in terms of sources, one of the things that I really love is I love to use newspaper, contemporaneous newspaper ads, because I think it's a very easy way to talk about social media. So one of the points I make about the ladies editorial when I talk about it with students, and you can see from that slide, Krista, I don't know, can we go back to that? You now have it. Can we go back to that slide that I had of the ladies? I think it's back a bunch. If you just flip back, I'll keep talking. If you go, I don't know where, just go, it's forward from there. This is where Krista said to me, do you want to control your slides? And I was like, really? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, stop there. You can see over here, this is the actual ad. And one of the things I've done here is I've given you a list of some of the places that ad ran. And so this is a way of getting to talk about how newspapers in this period are much more like social media than we often think they are. When something's interesting to everybody, when something's exciting, newspaper editors pick it up and they run with it. And so that for us, in the same way, I find that students can be like, oh yeah, I get that. Like, that tells you something about this piece that in and of itself, we can see all across the Northeast, people were interested in enough in it that it was reprinted. And then we have to comment that the Southern newspapers burned during the Civil War. So probably this went south just because I've seen it in other kinds of places, but we don't have as much evidence for that. This, I don't know what the response to it is specifically. I can tell you that it is not unique or unusual in the transatlantic period to have this kind of argument for women voting. And in addition to my book, you could read, Rosie Zagari has a wonderful book called Revolutionary Backlash. And what my book does, and what Rosie's book did a long time ago, was it tried to argue that that this idea we have about this being a period in which there's only one point of view on women is incorrect, and that we actually have different points of view on women. And so one of the great opponents to Eliza Harriet, the public lecturer, is Benjamin Rush and the Young Ladies Academy. And so I believe that the Young Ladies Academy and Republican motherhood, which I know a number of people teach, is actually a conservative argument about female education in response to this argument about female education, that women ought to be able to participate in government and at least vote, which is what women were allowed to do are going to be allowed to do in New Jersey. And so that's a way of rethinking that we have multiple voices. So one of the things I really care my students understand is, even though we talk about history as like this thing happens and then this thing happens, at any given moment, there are people with multiple voices. And we often lose people from history who don't control the written record. And so we have to be very careful not to have loudest the people who are in the written record. And so newspapers for me are often a source where we can sometimes catch a glimpse of another voice. So it's a great question. I happen to love this. I love this document, but there's wonderful resources at the Museum of the American Revolution online relating to this topic. And they actually have some great poll lists showing you all the names that include women, and they're working their way through identifying them. So it's a really exciting thing, I think.
Absolutely. We've got some past theme book articles that cover some of that content as well. So if you're looking for more, shoot Krista a note, and I've got the old PDFs. Amanda did mention she did get your book from the local library. All right, follow-up question to that. And again, keep dropping in your questions here. Is there a known author or author of the ladies? Do we know who actually penned it?
Yeah, no, we don't. I would have loved to have known that. I was able to identify Eliza Harriet in an editorial she wrote that I showed on the slide about that women would be able to join the college and the forum, because she explicitly wrote about how that was the point of the lady lecturer. So, and she used language she used elsewhere. But many things written by women in this period are anonymous, and that's true of women's fiction and other pieces. The Mercy Otis Warren actually is the only woman we have ever identified who wrote a ratification essay. But the fact that one woman wrote a ratification essay, to me, always suggests probably a lot of women were thinking of writing a ratification essay. She was uniquely positioned to do that. She was a leading playwright and had great sort of connections with the press. I don't know myself whether someone like she was the author or whether it was somebody who we haven't yet discovered. But the more work that we do in this period, the more we find voices of people explicitly describing how they want to be included in representation. And I'll just have a side note on that. That's very true with if you teach with some of the petitions to end slavery. So petitions were ignored by historians because petitions have kind of faded out as a major form of political participation and speech. But historians have been able to show that in the 1760s, 1770s, 70s, 80s, basically even deep into the 19th century, petitions are understood as a very important part of political participation. And so instead of the way we've tended to think about petitions, which is like, oh, well, that's nothing, that doesn't count as anything, we increasingly think about people who participate in writing petitions as a form of trying to participate in government, of being represented, of requesting petitions. And we see that in the Stamp Act Congress, that Americans should have the right of petition. And so there again, we can teach some of those. There's actually a lot of those now up online. Massachusetts has, I think, put almost all the petitions they found by Black Americans and enslaved Black Americans up. A lot of other places are also. And we can think about what does a petition look like? How does that, again, describe who's imagining themselves as being represented, seeing the problems with political representation in a broader light? And the students actually love petitions because at least when I've taught other groups of people who teach secondary education, one of the assignments that a lot of schools often do is write your legislator. Write your legislator, write something like that. And if you explain to your students like that is a form of petition in some ways, there's a real connection to some of these petitions.
Absolutely. I want to show real quick. There's a comment from Derek about, the whole idea of we the people, and did, these framers mean it as we, meaning us and the people just like us? In a lot of ways, that's probably true. I think one thing that we're seeing in the education world is this idea of, were these people heroes or villains? And I think what we need to start thinking of is these people were people. And just like all of us today, they have some really good qualities. They have made some really, great decisions. They made some really terrible decisions. And I think we have to help our students look at people in history as real people. And I think the key to that is what is going to help our students think more critically and think more open-mindedly. And that's where those primary sources come in, because they help us see as best as we can what they know. It's kind of like, it's like eavesdropping on the past. When you read those letters and read the diary entries and listen to what these people had to say, that's our best way to get a sense of who they were and what they thought. But it's that primary source evidence that really drives.
Yeah, and I think, Lynn, this is something that I think is really important when people teach this topic. Like, we can lean too far into people in the past must not have thought certain things. And we can know, particularly around the time of the 1787 Constitution, right? Everybody there. One of the things that I tried to do in writing about Eliza Harriet was to force people to imagine, what did it feel like to write a document which we know changed from gendered to gender neutral in a space where a woman for the first time got up and gave 5 lectures in the hall, usually reserved for men. She gives the greatest oration known, the Demosthenes' Oration on the Crown. She explicitly writes women should be able to join the college in the forum. We don't actually know what was going inside everybody's head when they decided to make the federal Constitution open to the possibility that women could participate. Now, lots of them probably thought that was insane and nutty and whatever, but we just actually don't know that. Just like we don't actually know how every single person inside and outside the room read how the Constitution was interpreted, in the fact that it only used the word person and never used the word slave. So I think it's really important, even though we understand that power existed in a way that was exclusionary and that tended to prefer white males, that we hold open what we know from primary sources. Not everybody saw it the same way. And that gives us a space to talk about how the power in this period might feel one way, but lots of people try to live in a way that lived a different reality. And that's true in our own life. I always start, when I teach law students in American legal history, with the question, how do you think historians are going to remember the moment we live in? And they start thinking about it, and then they suddenly realize, like the moment that they themselves personally live in might not be the moment that it looks like if you add up all the legislation and this and this. And that's a way to remind ourselves that we live in this kind of plurality, both today and in the past.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. Question: why is Abigail Adams writing letters to her husband?
Oh, yeah, great question. And if you, that's probably one of the greatest Abigail Adams letters. It teaches exceptionally well. So it's a wonderful resource. It's also a resource that I sort of think everybody should know, because it shows up on Remember the Ladies, shows up on t-shirts. But it's also a really great teaching resource. She and her husband are apart for most of their marriage, and they develop a wonderful letter writing correspondence back and forth. And I personally think that the old book by Woody Holton on Abigail Adams, that really leans into discussing their correspondence, is a great read, just as a great read on Abigail Adams. But Abigail Adams's letters are a wonderful resource, and I know there's many places that have them, and they're wonderful because they allow you, like that letter alone begins by talking about things that are going on with the war, and then switches to the domestic, and then comes back to this topic, and so it really lets you think about what did life look like for women? How did they imagine the possibilities, just as well as this relationship? Many historians think Abigail Adams would have been a far better president than her husband, but not to be. But yeah, a great thing. And really, it's just Woody Holton's book on her is actually, like, you could take it to the beach and read it. So.
Excellent. And a lot of her letters are online with the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is our Massachusetts sponsor. So we got to give a little shout out there.
Yeah, and they're really nicely done there, and you can kind of click in and out of them and find the next letter and go back. So you can kind of, if you have more advanced high school students, there's a lot of things now that I think historical organizations have set up that let students sort of drop in one space and then explore beyond that, because a lot of letters are now linked, like what's the next letter that the person writes. And so you can kind of, before you know it, like someone's like, well, I read 4 letters, not just the one I was supposed to. So
No, I think that's a really good point. I'm going to reinforce Adrian's point. It's the reminder, and we need to remind our students, not everybody sees history the same way. That's the point of multiple perspectives and seeking those out when you're doing your research and making your projects. All right, Chris, I think we're pretty much have exhausted the Q&A box, but if anybody has anything, please stay on. Chris and I will stay on in case, especially if you have any questions about the final assessment, we're happy to answer them.
Yep. Or if anything occurs to you in the next week, just send me an email. I'm happy to respond and meet with you, whatever you find will be the best way to support you. There were a lot of wonderful resources that Dr. Builder mentioned, and I will do my best to compile them and add them to our running list. But I might be checking in with you, Dr. Builder, to make sure
I'm happy to do
that you shared. All right. So in close, thanks again to our sponsor, the Dr. Scholl Foundation. Make sure that if you have not yet, scan the QR code, fill out your survey. Please be sure that you do it within the next week. The sooner, the better. And do let us know if you have any questions at all. Dr. Builder, it was such a pleasure to learn from you and with you. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. But next time, let's do it so that everyone can just chat.
Over coffee, maybe.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. All right, I'm going to stop our